thank you for being here. I do appreciate the invitation to be here. For those of you who didn't watch earlier, we're studying from the Sermon on the Mount this week, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And so if you'll be reading that, especially Tuesday night and Wednesday night, we're going to spend today and tomorrow night in chapter 5. And then I'm going to try to get all of chapter 6 and 7 in Tuesday and Wednesday. It's going to be a bit of a challenge. We're going to hit some high notes and skip over some stuff. But the more you read it, the more you'll be prepared. And so I would encourage you to do that if you have the opportunity. I appreciate the chance to do this. This is wonderful material, and there's no way I can do it justice. But I do hope some of the things that we talk about will be of some profit to you. Thank you for having me again. Good to be with you. I do have to mention Jordan. Jordan wasn't here the last time I was here, and he is an immensely talented young man. Jordan's dad and I traveled to India together in 1998. Man, it's kind of hard to say. That's been a long time ago. And we spent nearly a month in India, and it was an experience I loved. Roger, Jordan's dad, hated. I think he hated every moment of it. He did a wonderful job, but he hated every moment of it. And he is an immensely talented guy, and I was really always been impressed that he did such a good job when he so despised what he was doing there. When I hear Jordan, I can close my eyes and hear his dad. I hope that's not offensive to you. And then when I open my eyes, the socks have got to go, man. His dad wears these socks too. Do y'all know this? Has Roger preached here? Okay. Do you know this, that he wears these weird socks? Peter tells us, 1 Peter chapter 1, that we are to gird, he uses this image, gird up the loins of your mind. Are you familiar with girding up your loins, taking your robe and pulling up, tucking it in your belt so you can work or fight? That's girding up the loins. That image would never have come into being if everybody wore socks like y'all wore. You gird up your loins and show those socks, and the enemy's just going to throw their sword down and walk away laughing. So y'all work on that with him, will you, while you have the opportunity. You're the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It's then good for nothing but to be trampled out or thrown out and trampled under the foot of men. You're the light of the world. A city that's set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. This is such a familiar passage of Scripture, which is the case with all of the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not sure that there's an aspect of the Sermon on the Mount that we are unfamiliar with just in the abstract. We have studied it, we have read it, we have looked at it, we have preached on it, we've taught it, so much so that we become so familiar with it that we sometimes don't stop and think about it. That's the way things that are important can become. Familiarity breeds contempt, and we sometimes dismiss things and fail to see the real value of them because they are so commonplace to us. Traffic laws. I'm sure you see people run stop signs all the time. They're just a suggestion where I live. Speed limits. As I pulled into town, I was amazed at how fast everybody in the Metroplex was driving. All of these traffic laws, speed limits, red lights, stop signs, we see them all the time. And all that's on our mind most of the time is, when's it going to change, or can I get through it before it changes, or how fast can I stop and go before that car gets here? And it takes a wreck sometimes for us to stop and appreciate how serious those things are. And if you don't believe in traffic laws, go to India and fear for your life, because that's what it's like to be in a car there where they don't have all those laws. We take things for granted, and until there's something serious that happens, we just kind of dismiss how important they are. I think that's true of this passage right here. The idea of influence in God's Word is a common theme. In fact, it's an Old Testament thing. And I think sometimes we fail to appreciate one of the things God expected from the nation of Israel was that the nation of Israel would behave in such a way so that God would bless them so immensely that all the world would look at them and come to an understanding and an appreciation of Yahweh. In the book of Ezekiel in chapter 36, when Ezekiel is prophesying about the return from captivity and that God was going to put a new heart and a new spirit in His people, one of the things he says towards the end of that chapter is, don't think I'm doing this for you, and I'm paraphrasing. He says, I'm doing this for me. People are going to go by Israel and they're going to see a land that was desolate and now it is plowed and it is blooming and it looks like the Garden of Eden, and they're going to know that I am God. And I think sometimes we fail to appreciate that that's what Israel's task was among the nations. The scripture reading was from Isaiah 55. If you, in that section, which is the strongly messianic section of Isaiah, when you get over to chapter 62 and he's describing more of this imagery of the beauty of God's restoration of His people, one of the points that he makes is that the Gentile world is going to see light. And they're going to see light because of God's people. I want you to appreciate that's the task that falls to us as citizens of the kingdom of heaven. The Sermon on the Mount, if you weren't here this morning earlier, if you didn't hear this morning earlier, the Sermon on the Mount really begins at the end of chapter 4 when Jesus is described as going about preaching the good news of the kingdom. And even earlier that in chapter 4 when Jesus is first been baptized and he goes and he starts telling people, repent because the kingdom is here. The king that God had been promising for 1,000 years had entered the world and he was about to start ruling. He was going to ascend to the throne, which is what happens, Acts chapter 2, at Jesus' resurrection. And he sits at the right hand of God to start ruling not only His people, but all of the world. And Jesus is trying to tell people the kingdom is here. And all of this Old Testament imagery, where the children of Israel were expected to be faithful to God so that God could bless them. They were expected to be of a certain character because of their relationship with God. All of those things are realized in us, folks. Don't tell me the Old Testament's unimportant. You're never going to truly appreciate what it is that God's telling us as His people if you don't have it in the context of what God had laid down as principles for 1,000 years. And so here we are, modern day Israel. We are the children of God. We are the citizens of the kingdom. And as Jesus is trying to, in this sermon, tell us about what citizenship is about and how this kingdom works, He immediately goes from the Beatitudes to the statement about salt and light. And in doing so, describes us in the world. So let me ask you at the very outset, does Matthew chapter 5 verses 13, 14, 15, and 16 describe you in the world? I want you to appreciate, first of all, this would, if you take notes, this would be point number one. That this statement needs to be taken in its context. There is no salt or light without character. And that's what Jesus has been talking about in Matthew chapter 5. This is one of those passages, much like the parables, that we pull out of its context and we make all kinds of applications. Our applications aren't necessarily bad, but rarely do we make the application that Jesus is making. Why does He suddenly start talking about being the light of the world and being the salt of the earth? Well, because that's going to be a natural outgrowth of the Beatitudes. Have you thought about it that way? More often than not, when we think about influence, we think about moral things. I've got 3 daughters, and I still don't have any idea what I'm doing. Been raising them for 27 years almost, and I just stay confused all of the time. But one of the things that we've tried to do is underscore to them certain moral things and their influence, not only as Christians, but as the preacher's kids. And yes, that's unfair, but that's just their lot in life. They were born into a preacher's family, and so there's a burden you got to bear. And so you talk about influence, you talk about the way you dress. This is what we've underscored to our daughters. You run around looking like the rest of the world, people are going to assume you look like, that you are like the rest of the world. You dress in an immodest fashion, people are going to draw conclusions based upon the tightness of your clothes or the length of your skirt. Yes, they will. Don't tell me that they won't. I know better. People are going to draw conclusions about how you talk and whether you use crude language or whether you use profane language. And the world is going to draw conclusions about you and about me and about your mother based upon the things that you say and the way that you talk and your moral behavior. If you are loose with your body, not only are you bringing dishonor on the Lord, you're bringing dishonor on your parents and you're bringing dishonor on the Lord's people. And you need to understand the implications of those behaviors on spiritual people. But I don't know that I've ever sat down and told my girls, if you're meek, it's going to make an impact on somebody. If you're poor in spirit, people are going to notice that, and it's going to influence them. If you are merciful, people are going to look at that, and that's going to be so out of character for the rest of the world that it's going to have an impact. The reality is, Jesus puts this right after addressing the Beatitudes because the character that He demands of us as children of God, people who mourn, people who are poor in spirit, people who are meek, people who hunger and thirst for righteousness, people who are merciful, people who are pure in heart, people who are peacemakers. When He goes on in verse 11 and starts saying, you're going to be persecuted and blessed are you when you're persecuted, He's already talking about influence. You have impacted those people. They have seen that you are different. And they're going to react in one way or another. And that's powerful. Influence is not just about morality. It's not just about the things we do or don't do that are like the rest of the world. Whether we drink, whether we engage in sexual activity, whether we gamble, whether we do all these things that we identify as the gross sins of the world. Yes, we are told. Peter tells us in 1 Peter 2 and in 1 Peter 4. We're told the same thing in Philippians chapter 2. We're to abstain from worldliness. We're not to engage ourselves in the lusts of the world because we're to be lights in the world. We're to shine forth. But Jesus is not in that context here. In this context, He's saying, I want you to be someone who makes peace. And I want you to know that that's going to make you the light of the world. That that's going to make you the salt of the earth. That people are going to be impacted because of the way you behave. Not just the things you don't do, but the things that you do. Have you ever thought about that? There are a lot of ways I think that you could illustrate this. I tell you what occurs to me because it's been so much on my mind this year. We were talking with the elders were talking last night, and Joe said, what do you think the impact of all this COVID stuff is going to be on churches going forward? And there's a lot of impact that I'm afraid is going to take place. We have been isolated, and the devil's been busy finding ways to divide people. And we get so much information from the internet, and we are so free with our opinions and our views on social media. And I think sometimes we don't appreciate the impact. This is what I see when I think about the Beatitudes as it goes toward the idea of influence. There's a presidential election coming up. You're involved in a discussion online. Maybe it's social media, maybe it's just a text with somebody. Maybe it's a conversation with a worker if you're able to go work in person. And you have your political views. We are Americans after all. Politics are like life and death. When you express yourself and your views and your likes and your dislikes, do the people to whom you're expressing yourself immediately think, you know, they're working real hard to make sure that there's no enmity between us here? I can see in the person I can see in their comments the humility that is there, that they're not so much concerned about themselves. I can see in this person, I can hear in their comments that what's important to them is what God thinks about things and whether they stand right in the eyes of God. I can see and hear in their voice or see in their comments an angst, an affliction for what's happening morally in this country. Or are we just like all the other stubborn, mean-spirited people in the world that are screaming and hollering on social media day in and day out? You get in a big heated argument online, nobody's going to ask you if you drink. But they do know if you're meek. And I'm going to tell you, folks, the point of the influence commands here in Matthew chapter 5 is that people who are of the character that Jesus describes, they're going to be noticed. You're not going to be able to hide this. And so the first thing I want to challenge you toward is, if you want to think about your influence, not only think about the things you don't do, think about developing the qualities that make you blessed in the eyes of God and working at that so hard that people have to see this is who you are. If you go back to Matthew chapter 5, Jesus makes a kind of an interesting comment in verse 13 as he starts off when he says, you're the salt of the earth. If the salt loses its flavor, it's good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden underfoot of men. And I realize he's talking about salt that's lost its saltiness and would just be used to cover a road, keep weeds from growing, things like that. But I want you to think about what he says when he says it's good for nothing. And I want you to ask yourself, am I good for anything? When it comes to my influence and my character and my standing in the eyes of other people and whether or not they see me as the person God wants them to be. Because if not, if I don't manifest these qualities, what Jesus is saying, if I don't manifest these qualities, I'm useless to the scheme of God. Now, I don't think that means I'm without value to God. He died for me. He wants me to live for Him. The love is there. But when it comes to, as a citizen who's supposed to be what Israel was in the Old Testament, a light to the world, I am good for nothing if I do not become the person God wants me to be. That's where influence starts. Observation number 2. I think we need to appreciate, as he says in verse 16, when he says, let your light so shine, that influence is a tool to be used. And I think right now in this day and age, it's a very powerful tool to be used. Because of the vitriol, because of the protesting, because of the screaming and hollering, because of the division that goes on in this country and all around us, for someone to act differently, that's powerful. The images that he used are important images. Salt, and you full well know this, but I have to say it because we're preaching on it. Salt is a fairly commonly used commodity. Not only now, but then as well. In the Bible, it was used as a preservative. It was a seasoning. It was used to seal a covenant. It was to be offered with the sacrifices. It was an antiseptic. Salt was an important part of their life. Light was an important thing, a very powerful thing. In fact, when Jordan got up and started talking about going across the bridge and it's all cloudy and he can see the sun, I just knew what he was about to say was, well, we're going to talk about salt and light this morning, and there's that beacon on the hill. You blew it, buddy. You had an opportunity for a great introduction, okay? But it's an image we understand. We understand what it is to see light in the middle of darkness. We understand what it is to have things illuminated, to have a beacon up on a hill. These are These are aspects of life that are so fundamental that it shouldn't surprise us that Jesus uses them. But I want you to think for a minute about the application of them. I want you to think about salt for a second. One of my closest friends, I don't know how he doesn't have high blood pressure. He puts salt on everything. Now, I don't mean he puts a little salt on everything. I mean before he tastes anything. We order pizza. And the first thing he does is get the salt shaker out, put salt on it. Okay, there's something wrong with him because he obviously can't taste salt unless it's in huge, vast amounts. For the average person, if you put too much salt on something, it doesn't taste good, does it? Salt's one of those things that a little bit goes a long way. Well, I think that's an image that we need to appreciate because of all the things that salt would have been used for in Jesus' day, it is the flavoring aspect that Jesus points out here. If the salt has lost its flavor, what good is it? You're eating something that has very little flavor. You don't have salt to bring out the flavor, but it doesn't take much. I tell you, the thing that always pops into my mind when I read this is Genesis chapter 18. When God visits Abraham before he destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham knows that Lot and his family are there. And God tells him, I'm going to go down and I'm going to look over Sodom and Gomorrah. And if what I'm hearing is true, I'm going to destroy it. And Abraham's response is, would you destroy the entire city for the sake of, if you could just find 50 righteous men, now is it ringing a bell? If you could find 50 righteous men, would you destroy it? God says no. Abraham was a bold man because he starts bargaining with God. Can you imagine doing this? What about 45? Can you go 45? Okay, I won't destroy it for 45. Okay, what about 30? Would you go 30? Lord, you're going to destroy 30 good men? Nope, wouldn't destroy it for 30. 20? Nope, won't destroy it for 20. 10? Gets all the way down to 10. And we read that, and again, my thought is, man, Abraham is bold. You know, if I did that, the Lord would strike me down. But here's the thing that really gets my attention. In a city that is so wicked, that their thoughts were so reprehensible to God and their activities so absolutely abominable that God is going to destroy them with fire and brimstone, 10 men would have made the difference. Why? Because it doesn't take a lot of righteous influence to make an impact on the world around us. And I think that's part of the reason that Jesus uses this image. We need to appreciate that we don't have to have 400 million Christians to make an impact upon the world. If the salt loses its flavor, it's not any good. But it doesn't take a lot of us. It just takes us being what we are to be. And I would say the same thing in regards to light. In John's gospel, light is a very powerful image. John starts at the very beginning. And I personally, just my opinion is that John had heard Jesus several times talk about being the light of the world, and that really stuck in his head. Because a lot of the stories that John tells, John with Jesus, his entire public ministry, surely he could have picked a lot of things, but 3 or 4 different times, John fixes on an occasion where Jesus uses this imagery. Starts off, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, same was with God in the beginning, in Him was light. And the light shined in the darkness. He uses the image of illumination piercing the darkness, and that's where he starts. And then you get to chapter 8, and Jesus is the light of the world. And you get to chapter 9, and Jesus is the light of the world. And you get to chapter 12, and Jesus is the light of the world. And then you go back to Matthew 5 and realize that Jesus is saying, you're the light of the world. We sing praises about Jesus' work. We observe the Lord's Supper every first day of the week because of Jesus' work. We talk about Philippians chapter 2 and how Jesus emptied Himself and took upon Himself the form of a servant and made sacrifices for us. We praise the goodness of Jesus, the power that He had, the miracles that He did, the mentality that He had, the teaching that He did. Do you appreciate that Jesus said, your job is the same as mine? I came to show you God. Now you go show everybody else God. This is not something, folks, that we ought to take lightly. What we are doing in our character is demanding that people understand what the kingdom of heaven is all about. That it's not about what the televangelists show us with all of their gilded lifestyle. It's not about the health and wealth. I mean, we're going to deal with cancer. We're going to deal with tragedy. Our homes are going to flood. We're going to have hurricanes and tornadoes and hailstorms. We're going to have to deal with an imperfect world like everybody else. But we're going to deal with it as God's people and illuminate the world as to what can be. But we have to decide that we're going to be the people that show that we're going to be the light. If you go over to Peter's comments, and I've already mentioned 1 Peter 2 and Philippians 2, Peter, I think, almost has to be drawing upon the imagery that Jesus offers when he talks about being the light of the world and that we are the light of the world. Because in 1 Peter chapter 2, when Peter talks about our relationship with God and the fact that we are a people, he says in verse 9, who are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, His own special people. Well, what he's saying here is essentially the same thing Jesus is saying in His public ministry. Here's the kingdom. Anybody can be a citizen. Citizenship's not from lineage. It's not from talent. It's not from power. It's not from money. Citizenship is a character issue that you choose to adopt. And once you adopt that, you become God's special people. And His admonition then in verse 12, Peter says, having your conduct, your behavior honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works that they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. What good works? That's the question. What are you doing to influence people around you? Coming to services on Sunday. Great. Good deal. Come to services on Wednesday. Great. Good deal. Come to services during the gospel meeting, even though my kids have ball practice. Great. You're establishing some great priorities for your kids. You're doing good. You're saying to everybody else on the soccer team, softball team, baseball team, whatever it is, that this is where our priorities are. Great. Let's go back to the Beatitudes. Are you being meek? Are you being merciful? Are you being a peacemaker? Do people see that you're standing before God's the most important thing in your life? And are you doing that boldly, or are you hiding that? Because again, when Jesus at the end of the Beatitude says, blessed are you when men will revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake, I'm going to tell you folks, there is an inevitability to influence. And the inevitability is if you do it the way God tells you to do it, you're not going to be the most popular people in town or on the block or in the school. And you're liable to be made fun of, and you're liable to be criticized, and you're liable to be taken advantage of at work because you are the humble person, the mild-mannered person, the meek person, the person that's trying to do things right, the person that is not the hypocrite, the person that is simply trying to show what it is to live a godly life. What good works are we doing? Or are we just blending in with the rest of the world but not doing the evil stuff? And that brings you to the conclusion, last point that I would make, and that is we need to appreciate why. What's your aim? What's your motive? Jesus says, let your light so shine before men that they might see your good works and glorify the Father. I think this is the key for us to really get down. In the Beatitude lessons we were talking this morning, when we were talking about the idea of what it means to be blessed, I believe the idea is to make sure my standing before God is proper, that blessed describes God's judgment upon me. In His eyes, that's who I am. And therefore, the most important thing in my life needs to be where I stand before God all the time. And I think that comes to bear then on the influence part. Why is it that we hesitate about our influence? Well, because we don't want to be seen as different. Because we don't want people to think poorly of us or make fun of us. Because we focus on us. What happens when we focus upon God? I'm doing these things not because I'm just trying to be different. I'm acting this way not just because it's fun to be different. I'm adopting this character not just because that's the glorious thing in my life. I'm doing these things because I want you to be introduced to my King. In my lifetime, and maybe this is just a function of me becoming more aware as I get older. In my lifetime, Christians have become politically minded and vocal and active in ways that I've never seen. Now, some of you older heads, maybe it's always been that way and I just didn't pay enough attention. And a lot of people are concerned about our government, our culture, our society. Certainly it is trending downward. I think William Bennett called it slouching toward Gomorrah some years ago in a book that he wrote. I hate to see what's coming. I've got 3 daughters. One's getting married in a couple of months. They'll get married, start a family, and Lord willing, the other 2 will at some point. If you're interested, there are application forms online. And I'll be glad to work out a dowry with you. And I don't mean I'm paying you. I mean you're paying me. But I look at my kids and I look at my life and, man, I grew up in the best of times. And I don't know that it's going to be the best of times for them going forward. You younger folks, you better brace yourselves. You better make sure you really trust God, because I'm afraid your trust is going to be tested in ways that my generation's trust hasn't been tested. And so I share those concerns. I do. I don't know what's going to happen. If assemblies like this are going to be outlawed, if Christianity is going to be branded some kind of hate group. But I tell you, in spite of all of that, who becomes the next president is not the answer. Who's voted into Congress or who's sitting on the Supreme Court is not going to be the one thing that makes all the difference. What makes all the difference is that Jesus Christ sits at the right hand of God as King, ruling over everything. And God's people recognize that. We are citizens and we know who's really running the show. And I'm going to tell you what I think needs to happen among Christians who are bold enough to have political arguments right and left. Well, let's argue for the real kingdom, shall we? Our good works are supposed to glorify the Father in heaven. Like the children of Israel were supposed to point the Gentiles to the light of the Lord, so we are supposed to be showing the world what God is and what God can do to people. How He can take people described in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, unrighteous people who can't inherit the kingdom of God, sexually immoral and idolaters and adulterers and all these kinds of horrible things. And God can sanctify us and cleanse us and justify us, and we can be godly people in this world no matter who's elected and no matter how bad it gets. And you kids need to understand this. 30 years from now, no matter how bad this country is, you can be godly because the King sits on His throne, and nothing's going to change that. And so the question is that what I'm living for? We're not trying to bring people to the Campbell Road Church of Christ, folks. We're not trying to bring people to sit at the feet of Ricky Jenkins and Jordan Schaus and Noah Dieselkamp, even though they're all capable. We're not trying to influence people so that the United States of America can be great again or stay great. We're influencing people to come to God, to live forever, to praise the King, to look upon the very face of God and enjoy the blessings that we can't even appreciate. Paul tells us, not even entered into the mind of man what God has prepared for those who love Him. And we start all of that process now by adopting the character God has offered us and then going out and being unashamed of who we are. No, I'm not going to get in that political fight, but if you're interested in the government, let me tell you about my King. No, I'm not going to get caught up in all this racism and social injustice stuff, and I am not going to divide with you because in the kingdom of which I am a part, there is no social injustice. There's neither male or female, bond or free, Jew or Gentile, black or white, or any other distinction you want to make. It is time for God's people to stand up and influence the world for our King. And so I challenge you. Examine your life in light of your influence. Are you just getting up and going through every day just to get through the day so you can make $1 and work towards your next vacation or paying off your house or the boat that you've always wanted or a new hunting lease? Is that what life is to you? Is it all about your kids and whether or not they're going to be the next star on the Little League baseball team? I'm going to tell you something, folks. You're going to get up one day and you're going to look at your calendar and your youngest is going to turn 20. No more teenagers. And you're going to look back at the quilt that's laying on your couch that your wife took all of the shirts from soccer and band and softball and choir and made this beautiful quilt out of it. And there's going to be all-stars and state championships and all district teams. And there's going to be all this stuff that is so important to you. And you're going to cry a tear hoping that all your child does is serve the Lord, because those things won't matter anything. And you're going to wonder whether you did it right, whether you were the influence you were supposed to be, whether you manifested the character that you were supposed to show, because that's all that matters in life. We are going to grow old and we are going to die and we are going to face our God. And we better pay attention to what we're doing, that our good works might point people to the glorification of the God that we serve and the wonderful being that He is and what He has done for us and what He will do for us. God help us. Everybody's got an influence, whether you think you do or not. People are going to see the way that we live our life. They're going to see how we act. They're going to see the good and they're going to see the bad. I've got to tell you this story because it hits me. What an illustration. I've got a friend. I don't spend a lot of time on Facebook. When I do spend time on Facebook, it's usually a happy birthday or a sarcastic comment. And a friend of mine was a big Cincinnati Reds fan when the Reds got knocked out of the baseball playoffs the other day. he put some post on there bemoaning it. And my comment was, "Suck it up, Buttercup." Right above my comment was a comment from a guy that I went to Florida College with 40 years ago. This has been 40 years. Great big old boy, good athlete, bad attitude. And I was a pretty good sized kid and thought I was a good athlete and thought I had a great attitude. I don't know how many times we butted heads on and off the field. And I know of all the people I went to FC with, if there was anybody that I would have described as an enemy, it probably would have been him. And that was on me. My attitude stunk. And I saw his name on this post, and I thought, he's faithful to the Lord? So I sent him a note and said, "I saw your post. It was good to see your name, and I'm sorry for the way I acted to you when we were teenagers." This morning, I got a note back from him saying, "I'm sorry I acted the way I acted toward you. I was the one with the problem." Now, he wasn't, but nonetheless. For 40 years, I've wondered about him. And I've wondered what he would think if he knew I was a preacher. Because way back then, he wouldn't have seen anything in me that would have pointed him to God. And I am thankful to the Lord that he's faithful. And he's faithful in spite of me. And I tell you, folks, we need to understand what we're doing day in and day out in the smallest things has an impact. And Jesus expects that impact to be good. You're the salt. You're the light. It's our job now. May God help us to do it the way He tells us to. So I thank you for your attention. I hope those will be some things you'll think about. We will build on this. If you're going to be able to be here tomorrow night, I want to encourage you to read the rest of chapter 5, because the rest of chapter 5 builds on the things that he says in the first few verses. And so we'll talk a little bit about our relationship to God's law tomorrow night. Thank you so much. May the Lord bless you. If you're subject to the invitation this morning, we could help you in any regard.